Jesus did not lead a revolt against the Romans. But if you ask people like Ben Shapiro, you might get a different answer. Ben Shapiro is a popular conservative talk show host, podcast host, The Ben Shapiro Show, editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, a practicing Orthodox Jew, very popular, especially in America, but really globally. He's from Southern California, as I am. And I'm using him as part of this discussion about whether or not Jesus led a revolt against the Romans, and that's why he was put to death. Because that's his position, which he stated on a popular podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, that's been viewed by over 10.5 million people to date. And so I felt it would be good to use the part of that podcast where Ben shares his views with Joe Rogan and then discuss whether or not it's true, whether or not Jesus actually led a revolt against the Romans, and that's why he was put to death. Now, I believe Ben Shapiro is a very intelligent man. I enjoy a lot of his material. In fact, I think I have at least one of his videos on my Communication and Growing Up Right playlist regarding racism and income inequality. I think Ben's views on subjects ranging from politics, not everything politically, but a lot of what he says politically, I find myself agreeing with, and subjects like transgenderism. I think he does some outstanding analysis. And you can tell just by listening to him that he's very smart, right? He has a good head on his shoulders. He's quick thinking. And he obviously is well studied and reads a lot. But as we were talking about in the pre-show also with certain Christian scholars, education, smarts, being well read is not always enough. Sometimes you just don't know certain stuff. Other times, your own preferences, what you choose to believe in spite of the facts, can get in the way of your analysis of facts. It can make you think something that if you didn't really have a strong view against what you were discussing, you might think differently. And we all have to be careful of that. We all have to make sure we're not ignoring critical information just because we have a preferred view. How do we do that? Make sure your preferred view is based on the evidence. Right? Sometimes we grow up thinking a certain way or being taught a certain way, and we all have to at some point challenge those views or have them challenged for us so that we can really understand different positions than how we see something. If we're only always looking at what we want to believe and evidence or information that only points to what we want to believe, we may find ourselves with beliefs that are not the best. And I'm a huge proponent of having beliefs based on the best evidence. Sometimes our beliefs change just because the evidence changes or we learn more about something. But there are times when the evidence is what it is, right? It's just the historical information that exists, and while it may be added to on some level if we find out more, we have enough based on what exists to formulate a strong position. But we should always be considerate of others and say, okay, what are you saying? Is that you don't think the same as me? Well, why is that? My evidence, if it's not better than my evidence, then I'm going to stay with my belief. But I see what you're saying. So we have to be careful with that and make sure that we're not ignoring what other people are saying. And that's what I want to do today, with Ben Shapiro and Joe Rogan and the brief discussion that they had about Jesus and whether or not he led a revolt against Rome. I don't believe the evidence supports at all that Jesus led a revolt against Rome and that's why he was executed. In fact, I believe the evidence from the first century and early second century, biblical and Roman, shows that that's exactly the opposite of what he did. And that what he actually did was teach things that the Jewish religious leaders of his day rejected. And they rejected him as the one he claimed to be. And so went to the Romans, Pontius Pilate specifically, to have him executed. And you'll see more why they went to Pilate in order to get rid of Jesus as we go through the evidence in just a moment. So, before we get right into that evidence, I want to point out that Rome, the word Rome, like the ancient city of Rome, is not mentioned one single time in the 4 best records of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the New Testament. Those are the 4 best represented records of Jesus' life. Not one time is Rome mentioned in those records. And I find that interesting because if Jesus led a revolt against Rome and it was understood that's what he was doing, right? He actually intended to do that. I would think Rome would figure in a little bit more in those 4 New Testament records. Now, the word Roman or Romans, referring to people, is mentioned one time in one of those New Testament records of Jesus' life. John chapter 11, verse 48. So let's go ahead and bring that up. John chapter 11, verse 48. And we'll go ahead and read a little of the context. We'll read from verses 39 through 53, so we get kind of a sense of what's happening and why the term Roman or Romans is coming up. This is an account involving the resurrection of Jesus' friend Lazarus. And so in verse 39, Jesus says, "Take the stone away." They're at Lazarus' tomb. "Take the stone away, Martha." Take the stone away. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by now he must smell, for it is 4 days." Verse 40, Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Verse 41, therefore they took the stone away. Now Jesus raised his eyes heavenward and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. True," verse 42, "I knew that you always hear me, but on account of the crowd standing around I spoke, in order that they might believe that you sent me forth." Verse 43, and when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come on out." Verse 44, the man that had been dead came out with his feet and hands bound with wrappings, and his countenance was bound about with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." Verse 45, therefore many of the Jews that had come to Mary and that beheld what he did put faith in him. But some of them went off to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. Verse 47, consequently, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the Sanhedrin together and began to say, "What are we to do? Because this man performs many signs." Verse 48, if we let him alone this way, they will all put faith in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Right? Because the Jews were under Roman occupation. So according to this account, the religious leaders, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together the Sanhedrin, Jewish court, and they were concerned about the things Jesus was doing, so much so that they were thinking the Romans would come and take away their place in their nation. Something that ended up happening in 70 AD. Verse 49, but a certain one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you do not know anything at all. Verse 50, and you do not reason that it is to your benefit for one man to die in behalf of the people, and not for the whole nation to be destroyed. This, though he did not save his own originality, but because he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was destined to die for the nation. And not only for the nation, or not for the nation only, but in order that the children of God who are scattered about might also be gathered together in one. Therefore, from that day on, they took counsel to kill him. All right, so this represents the one time the word Roman or Romans is used in the four gospel accounts of Jesus' life. The word Rome is not used at all. And you can see from this one usage of Roman or Romans, right here in verse 48, that it's in the context of the Jews, the high priest, the Pharisees, the chief priests, being concerned that the Romans would take away their place in their nation if all these people start following Jesus. Okay? So does this indicate that Jesus was leading a revolt against the Romans? There's nothing in this account or anywhere else, as we'll see, at least that I'm going to show you and that I think you'll read, that in any way explicitly ties Jesus' activity to a revolt against Rome. The only thing that in any way conceivably does that is right here, where the Jews who rejected Jesus, the ones that didn't believe in him, were concerned about the things he was doing that involved miracles, like raising the dead. Whether you believe that or not, that's not the point. The text links the Jewish religious leaders of that time concern about Jesus and the effect that it will have on their nation because of the Romans with the miracles he's doing. They don't say anything according to this account that would indicate that he is creating a problem for Rome. They don't say anything in this account that he's challenging Caesar, making himself a king. They're concerned about the people's response to his miracle working. That's it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look and a listen to Ben Shapiro on the Joe Rogan show and see what he has to say about Jesus and whether or not what he says about Jesus fits the account we just read. And then we're going to go into other books of the New Testament and other early sources, Roman sources, to see if anything there fits with what Ben is about to say. So here we go. Make sure we get the volume up right.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think he was?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So he became legend in story, and it became a bigger and bigger deal as time went on.
Yeah, he had a group of followers, and then that gradually grew, and then
Do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a Jew.
Okay, so let's just hear that one more time so we can have it fully in our mind what his position is. And again, the show, there's a link to this show in the description below. And I will be commenting on at least one other part of this interview, maybe two. The one other part for sure I'm going to talk about is their discussion of homosexuality. I found it very interesting for several reasons that I'll talk about another time. And I might discuss what they each have to say about evolution and creation. But let's just go back to this part about Jesus and whether or not he started a revolution against Rome, led a revolt against Rome. And so you clearly understand what Ben's position is.
Right?
Significant? No. We don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was?
Let's just go back and hear that one part.
Gospels, which were written.
He was just a prophet. Right?
Significant? No. We don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think he was?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So
Okay, that's the essential point that I'm talking about today. Was he just someone who led a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, as Ben said? So we have this text from John where the Jewish religious leaders, the chief priests, the Pharisees, and the high priest Caiaphas, convening the Sanhedrin, they say if we let him alone, they'll all put faith in him, and the Romans will come and take away our place in our nation. But there's nothing in the account leading up to this or preceding this, nothing, that shows Jesus saying or doing anything that would indicate explicitly he's leading a revolt against Rome. Only thing in all four of the Gospels of the New Testament is this right here. It's those who rejected Jesus claiming that if the Jews in that area begin to continue to put faith in Jesus, it will lead to Rome coming and taking away their place in their nation. That's different from Jesus openly leading a revolt against Rome. Isn't it? Isn't it different if someone is simply teaching things that have nothing directly to do with Rome, and as a result everybody starts following him, and those who reject him claiming, as a result of more people following him, that the Romans will come and displace them? There's a difference between that happening and someone openly saying, for us Jews to get out under Roman occupation, you need me to be your king. I'm the king of the Jews. Like Pilate later writes in the inscription over Jesus' head after he's executed, or while he's being executed. But Jesus doesn't say that. He never says that. Other people say it, and he implicitly affirms it by saying that they said it without denying it. But even Pilate, as you'll see when that happens, doesn't accuse him of being a threat to Caesar because of him saying that they said it, in that sense indirectly affirming it. So this is really the sum and total of the references to Rome, Romans, or Roman in the four Gospels, and the only piece of evidence I could find that would in any way tie the activities of Jesus to the Romans coming and displacing their place in their nation. And nothing about what Jesus does in this context in any way suggests that's what he wants to have happen, that that's what he's trying to do. It's what his enemies claimed would happen and used as a basis for trying to stop him, right? For thinking that he has to die in order for us to keep living because the Romans will come and take us away. The Romans will destroy us. If we don't take care of this guy, then they'll take care of us. But that doesn't mean, one, that's the teaching of Jesus, or two, that's what really would have happened. In fact, they ended up having Jesus put to death, and then that's what ended up happening. So, again, all Ben can point to, according to what I've reviewed, and we'll look at more in a moment, the only text in the four Gospels mentioning Rome, well, there's not even one that does that, but Romans or Roman, really Romans, right? The Romans will come and take away, is in the mouth of his enemies. The Jewish religious leaders who were rejecting Jesus because of the things he was doing that people were putting faith in that had nothing to do with a revolt against Rome. Now, the word Caesar is mentioned 8 times in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament recording the life and activities of Jesus. It's mentioned in Luke 2:1 regarding the registration that occurred during Caesar Augustus. It's mentioned in Luke 3:1 where the declaration comes to John about what he's going to do during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And then there's a famous account involving Jesus and Caesar in Luke chapter 20, verses 22 through 25. It's also an account that's given in Matthew and in Mark, 3 of the 4 New Testament gospel accounts. There's also a reference in Luke 23:2 and John 19:12 and 15. Let's read 3 of those, right? I referenced the one in Luke 2:1, the registration during Caesar Augustus. I referenced the mention of Caesar Augustus in Luke 3:1. Let's go ahead and read the account in Luke 20 involving Jesus and Caesar. That's also an account given in Matthew and Mark. Luke 20. We'll be reading Luke 20, 22. Sorry about that. We'll be reading Luke 20, 22 through 25. And let's see what this account has to say. It says up here, the scribes and the chief priests were trying to get their hands on him, but they feared the people because they thought he was talking about him with some of his illustrations. So they dispatched certain people to try to catch him in his speech. And then it says in verse 21, they questioned him saying, "Teacher, we know you speak and teach correctly and show no partiality." They're trying to butter him up, get on his good side. "But you teach the way of God in line with truth." We know that. We know that about you, teacher. So, verse 22, is it lawful for us to pay tax to Caesar or not? Now, if you were leading a revolt against Rome, I think your answer to this question would be in the negative. I certainly don't see that you would affirm positively that you should keep giving your money, your taxes, the things that you would need as a nation to survive and to thrive and to displace the Roman occupation. It doesn't strike me as reasonable to believe that the leader of a revolt against Rome would tell someone to pay the taxes, to give Caesar taxes, give Caesar your money. So they ask him. Verse 23 says, "But he detected their cunning and said to them, 'Show me a denarius. Whose inscription, whose image and inscription does it have?' They said, 'Caesar's,'" right? So he shows them a coin, or they show him a coin. And the coins were minted with the image of the current ruler, the current Caesar, sometimes with other rulers in different regions. But in the case of Rome, usually Caesar. And so they show him the coin. They confirm that it has Caesar's image on it. And so in verse 25, Jesus says to them, "By all means then, pay back Caesar's things to Caesar, but God's things to God." All right, so even in the context of John 11:48, the one time Romans is used, Rome is not used, Roman is not used, but the plural Romans was used, where Jesus is just doing miracles, doing things that are related to God, never mentions Rome, never mentions Caesar. Then Caesar is directly brought up to him on the question of paying taxes. And he says, give it back to Caesar and give God his things. So I find it powerful evidence against Ben's position that Jesus was leading a revolt against Rome for him to affirm, when directly asked the question whether or not they should pay taxes to Caesar, that they should. And then go right back to the spiritual things involving God, which I believe you will see, just like in the context of John 11, are really the basis for why the Jews are trying to trick him. The Jews of this time, many of the Jews, not all the Jews, the ones who rejected him. They kept trying to pit him against Rome, exactly like Ben does. Ben, in spite of all his learning and his good sense in many other respects, sees Jesus as leading a revolt against Rome and therefore rightly being executed. When the texts show that it was those who rejected him who feared the Romans, in a context where he doesn't even talk about Rome or the Romans, isn't doing anything to subvert Roman rule or occupation. And then when he's directly asked about paying taxes to Rome, to Caesar, he says you should do it. Yet we get Ben, just like the Jews here, constantly trying to create this conflict between Jesus and Rome. Now let's take a look at Luke 23:2. That's another instance where Caesar is referenced. We'll read a little of the context there as well. Luke 23:2. We'll go ahead and read from Luke 22:66 through Luke 23:16 so we get a good sense of the context. Luke 22:66. At length, when it became day, the assembly of older men of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they haled him into the Sanhedrin hall, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "Even if I told you, you would not believe it at all." Right now, notice they don't say, "Are you a king? Are you trying to displace Caesar?" Right? Because we're worried, according to John 11:48, that the Romans are going to come because of all you're doing, all this stuff, all these miracles, people believing in you. We think that's going to cause the Romans to come and displace us. Is that what you're doing? They don't even ask him that, right? All they say is, "All right, look, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Are you the one we've been expecting?" Right? Even like we read in the Targum of Isaiah 11, like I discussed and showed in CW Jaw Talk 41. Are you that Messiah that we've been expecting? If so, tell us. And then he says, "Even if I told you, you wouldn't believe." Verse 68, "Moreover, if I questioned you, you wouldn't answer at all. However, from now on," this is Jesus talking, "the Son of Man will be sitting at the powerful right hand of God." At this, they all said, "Are you therefore the Son of God?" He said to them, "You yourselves are saying that I am." And remember, as we've also discussed in my CW Jaw Talk series and the sub-series on pre-Christian evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah, 4Q246 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Son of God text, shows that during this time there were messianic associations involving the Messiah's identity as the Son of God. And here they openly ask him, right? First they ask him if you're the Christ, and then he tells them that he'll be sitting at the powerful right hand of God, right? Just like the prophecies about the Messiah, "Sit at my right hand until I place your enemies as your footstool." All these are associated, Christ sitting at the right hand of God, with being the Son of God, consistent with 4Q246. And he says, "You yourselves are saying that I am," right? So he doesn't deny it. And in referring to them affirming it, he implicitly affirms it. It's an idiom of speech at that time. But it's not an explicit identification. But it's enough for them to say, "Why do we need further witnesses? For we ourselves have heard it out of his own mouth." Now again, nothing in here is talking about being made a king in opposition to Caesar. They ask him if he's the biblical Christ, right? The Christ. That's a biblical idea. That's not a Roman idea or even anything they would really know about. And then there's this heavenly sitting at that right hand of God, right? That's in heaven. It's not on earth. And likely they would understand that in relation to the Davidic Psalm and its understanding in relation to the Messiah, if that's how they viewed it. That's how we view it, right, as Christians. Perhaps they viewed it that way as well. Certainly they understood what he was saying, because in the context of Psalm 2, where it talks about the Davidic king, the Messianic king, we believe, in a future sense, but also David in a direct sense, but not completely, not in every respect, as we talked about in my CW Jaw Talk series on that text, they clearly associate him sitting at God's right hand with being the Son of God. Right? You are my son, I today have become your father, I have begotten you. Which as Christians we apply to Jesus' resurrection, but in the original sense applies to David as being installed as the Messianic king, as the king of God's people. And so they understand those associations, right? If you're the Christ, tell us. And then he tells them about being the Son of Man at God's right hand. So you're the Son of God. You yourselves are saying that I am. Why do we need more witnesses? We just heard it. So the multitude of them rose, one and all, and led him to Pilate. Then they started to accuse him, saying, "This man we found subverting our nation and forbidding the paying of taxes to Caesar, and saying he himself is Christ, a king." Now, right there's two things that are not true. He did not subvert the paying of taxes to Caesar. We read it in Luke 20. It's also in Matthew and in Mark, same account, where he directly told them to give Caesar's things back to Caesar. It's one of the most famous accounts of Jesus in the New Testament. So they're lying here, right? They're creating a reason to Pilate, a Roman governor overseeing Judea, so that Pilate reacts, right? So he's like, oh, so this guy's trying to stop Caesar from getting his money? Oh, that's a big deal. Okay. They know that, right? That's why they sent people to him in the first place, to try to get him to say, no, it's not lawful to pay Caesar the tax. But he understood what they were trying to do, just like they're doing right here. Then they say, he said he was Christ, a king. Now, he didn't say he was a king. He didn't even say he was the Christ. He implied it through his response to them, and in saying he would sit at the right hand of God, right? If that's the fulfillment of Psalm 2, then there's definitely kingly associations with that. But that's at the right hand of God. He's not claiming, nor did he claim in front of the Jews prior to this text, that he was going to be a king on the earth. He didn't say not to pay Caesar the tax. So it's not true. Both of those are not true. These Jews here, not all Jews, we understand that. Jesus was a Jew. His earliest followers were Jews. That does not mean every Jew was a good person. Doesn't mean every Christian's a good person. We're talking about specific people. But Jesus definitely did not forbid the paying of taxes to Caesar. Now, ask yourself this, Ben, if you're watching. If Jesus led a revolt against Rome, right, if that's what his followers understood him to be doing, if that's what he was explicitly telling them he was doing, right, telling them he was doing it and then actually doing it by his actions, then there would be no reason for him, one, to tell them to pay Caesar taxes, and there would be no reason for him to deny being anything but an earthly ruler of some kind who could displace Caesar. Yet he didn't claim those things, right? He not only didn't forbid the paying of taxes to Caesar, but he didn't claim to be an earthly king. He claimed to be a heavenly king, you could say, by allusion to Psalm 2. And so Pilate asks him in verse 3, now Pilate asked him the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" In answer to him, he said, "You yourself are saying it." So that is in a way accepting that he is the king of the Jews. But Pilate didn't take that as meaning in an earthly sense, in a serious way, to be proclaiming himself a king like Caesar. We know that because Pilate in the next verse said to the chief priests and crowds, I find no crime in this man. Right? So, if Jesus was openly leading a revolt against Caesar, and he didn't want people to pay the tax to Caesar and claiming to be a king, there would be no reason for any of his followers or Jesus himself to deny those things to the Jews when they were meeting in the Sanhedrin, because that's what they all would have wanted, essentially, if he could do it, right? If he could deliver them in the sense that he believed he was there to achieve as this messianic figure. But there's nothing in the text that indicates that. Everything he says is speaking of things having to do with God, right? Give God's things back to God and Caesar's things to Caesar. That's a separation of earthly and non-human, non-earthly, heavenly. And so when he claims that he'll be seated at the right hand of God, that's not the same thing as claiming to be an earthly king, which is what they said to Pilate right here. Pilate then asks him directly, he says, you're saying that. So he doesn't say that. Now, Pilate may not have understood the idiom Jesus was using in the sense that the Jews did, but he was governor of Judea, and so he may have. Nevertheless, no matter how Pilate understood that answer, the records show he claimed to find no crime in him. And so it goes on to say they began to be insistent, saying he stirs up the people by teaching all throughout Judea, even starting out from Galilee to here. And then on hearing that, Pilate asked whether the man was a Galilean. After ascertaining that he was from the jurisdiction of Herod, he sent him on to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem in these days. Verse 8, when Herod saw Jesus, he rejoiced greatly. For over a considerable time he was wanting to see him because of having heard about him. He was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Now he began to question him with a good many words, but he made him no answer. Jesus didn't respond to him. However, the chief priests and the scribes kept standing up and vehemently accusing him. Now it says here, Herod had heard a lot about him. But Herod doesn't immediately start dealing with him in a way like someone who's trying to revolt against Rome. Right? Pilate at first doesn't find him to be a threat against Rome, not a crime, not committing a crime according to Roman law. Herod then gets a hold of him and wants to see a sign, right? So likely Herod was hearing about all these signs like we saw in John 11 in the context where the Jews who rejected Jesus were worried about the Romans, but that Jesus wasn't even talking about the Romans. He was doing signs. Here it says Herod was hearing about those signs, or he heard about him and he was hoping to see the signs that he was hearing about. So he began to question him, but Jesus didn't answer. It says, however, the chief priests and scribes kept standing up and vehemently accusing him. Then Herod, together with his soldier guards, discredited him, made fun of him by clothing him with a bright garment, and sent him back to Pilate. Both Herod and Pilate now became friends with each other on that very day, for before that they had continued at enmity between themselves. Pilate then called the chief priests and the rulers and the people together and said to them, you brought this man to me as one inciting the people to revolt. Right? That's very similar to what Ben said, like leading a revolt against Rome. So we have the Jews concerned about the Romans in John 11:48 in a context where Jesus doesn't talk about the Romans. It's the only time Romans or Rome is mentioned in the New Testament four Gospels. The only time is in the mouths of those who reject Jesus. It's never brought up by Jesus or his followers in the four Gospels. Then Jesus' religious enemies, those who rejected him, bring him to Pilate after trying to get him to not pay taxes to Caesar, which he doesn't do. He, in fact, promotes paying taxes to Caesar, says, give Caesar's things to Caesar. They come to Pilate, Caesar's representative in Judea, and tell him that he is, in fact, trying to interfere with the paying of taxes, which is not true, and that he's making himself a king like Caesar. Pilate questions him, finds no crime in him, even questions him directly about the king thing, and Jesus implicitly affirms it by saying that's what Pilate's saying. But Pilate doesn't take it in a way threatening to Caesar. Sends him over to Herod. Herod sends him back to Pilate. Pilate then addresses the Jews and says, you brought him to me as someone inciting a revolt. Very similar to Ben's claim, his words. Someone who was leading a revolt against Rome or the Romans. Pilate then says, look, I examined him in front of you, but found in this man no ground for the charges you are bringing against him. In fact, neither did Herod. He sent him back to us. And look, nothing deserving of death has been committed by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. So the records, in this case, the record written by Luke, someone who after Jesus went and compiled various testimonies from people who were with Jesus to put together an account like Matthew, Mark, and John, but different in its own right, where all these different things are put down. Nothing so far we've read in Luke indicates anything but that Jesus was for the paying of taxes to Caesar, that the Jews who rejected Jesus were trying to trick him and then lied about him when it came to the paying of taxes to Caesar, and that they implied to Pilate that he was claiming to be a king threatening Caesar. When he didn't do that, he claimed to be the Davidic king, likely of Psalm 2 in the context of sitting at the right hand of God, which Pilate didn't take as a threat to Caesar either. So Jesus neither meant it as a threat, and Pilate didn't take it as a threat, even though the Jews who rejected Jesus presented it as a threat. Lied about him, saying that he was prohibiting the paying of taxes to Caesar, when that's the exact opposite of what 3 accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament tell us he said. Now let's go to John 19. Last 2 times that Caesar is used in the 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament. John 19. It's mentioned twice here, the word Caesar, in verses 12 and 15. We'll go ahead and read John 19, 5 through 16, again to get a little of the context. John 19, 5 through 16. In verse 4, Pilate went out against them. See, I bring him outside you in order to know that I find no fault in him. And then in verse 5, accordingly, Jesus came outside wearing the thorny crown and the purple outer garments. And Pilate said to the Jews, look, the man. Verse 6, however, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they shouted, saying, impale him, impale him. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and impale him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to the law he ought to die, because he made himself God's son. Remember, that's exactly what they reacted to in the Sanhedrin, in the account we read in Luke, where they questioned him about being the Christ, and then he said he'd be seated at the right hand of God. Well, he said, you yourselves are saying that I am, in response to the Christ. And they said, well, are you the Son of God? And so that is on their mind, this claim to be the Son of God. And right here to Pilate, they tie his claim to be the Son of God or God's Son to their law. In verse 8, it says, when therefore Pilate heard this saying, he became more fearful. Remember, his wife had had a dream about him. He's confused about Jesus in many respects because of the way he's acting. The Jews are bringing him to Pilate on some very strange charges, right? Claiming to be God's son. And it says, and he entered into the governor's palace again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Verse 10, Hence Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to impale you?" Verse 11, Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority at all against me unless it had been granted to you from above. This is why the man that handed me over to you has greater sin." Verse 12, for this reason Pilate kept on seeking how to release him. Because again, what's Jesus doing? He's tying his situation to heaven. He's not acting like a political figure. He's acting like maybe someone who's religiously either crazed or sincere, but Pilate can't really figure out. But he's not acting political in the sense that Pilate would see as a threat. And so it says Pilate kept seeking how to release him because of that reason. But the Jews shouted, saying, "If you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. Every man making himself a king speaks against Caesar." Right? And that, again, that would be a king in a human sense. If someone's just out there claiming that they're going to be a king seated at the right hand of God, that's not a threat to Caesar. They may not like it, right? They may think you're nuts. But if you're claiming you're the Son of Man, you're going to be seated at the right hand of God in fulfillment of a messianic psalm, and you're not claiming to be a human king that's going to rival Caesar, they're not going to take that seriously, as you can see from this account right here. But the Jews aren't presenting it that way, are they? Just like we saw before. They're presenting him as a threat. He's subverting the nation, forbidding the paying of taxes to Caesar, and he's making himself a king. Every man who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. That's what the Jews are telling Pilate. They're trying to get him to understand, look, he's a political activist. Right? He's someone you should see as a threat. He's a threat to taxes, and he's a threat to Caesar's kingship, his rule. Verse 13, therefore Pilate, after hearing these words, brought Jesus outside, and he sat down on a judgment seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Verse 14, now it was preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "See your king." Verse 15, however, they shouted, take him away, impale him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I impale your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Verse 16, at that time, therefore, he handed him over to them to be impaled. Then they took charge of Jesus. So they needed Roman authority to get rid of Jesus. They do have a law. That law does allow them to kill people, doesn't it? In fact, according to the New Testament accounts, they tried to kill him several times. But here they're trying to do it officially. Right? They're in fear of the people. They're trying to get Rome to get rid of him. So they approached him about the taxes, tried to trick him there. Then they question him about who he is. He answers strictly according to the biblical text, the messianic text, about being a heavenly king. They then go to Pilate, present him as someone who's trying to lead a revolt and be an earthly king, interfering with Caesar's taxes. Pilate doesn't buy it, though. He doesn't believe that's what Jesus is doing, right? He questions him. He questions the Jews. He sends him to Herod. Herod has heard all these things about the miracles, but nothing apparently about him trying to lead a revolt against Rome. Right? The account didn't say that Herod asked him about all these rumors about revolt. It says he wanted to see the signs that he had heard about. Pilate asked him about being a king. He answers in a way that doesn't directly seem to be a threat in an earthly sense. He even says, my kingdom is no part of this world. If it were, my people would have thought that I shouldn't have been delivered over to the Jews. Right? And then he says, well, then are you a king? And that's actually over here, where he talks about that. right here, right? So in chapter 18, first Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Is this of your own originality you say this, or did the others tell you about me? Is this coming from you or coming from them?" And Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What did you do? My kingdom is no part of this world. If my kingdom were a part of this world, my attendants would have fought that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from this source." So Pilate knew this before we got into this whole later discussion leading up to John 19:16, where he eventually hands him over because the Jews reaffirmed their trust in Caesar, right? At this point, they've put Pilate in a position where he's either going to look like he's being overly sympathetic to someone who is being presented as a serious threat to Rome, to Caesar, or, Pilate doesn't really ultimately care about Jesus. He's just fearful because of his wife's dream and the way Jesus is acting. And he doesn't believe the Jews. Right? He does not believe their accusation against him after questioning Jesus and after Jesus tells him, "Look, my kingdom isn't part of this world." Right? I'm a king, but I'm not a king of this world. Just like he told the Jews in the Sanhedrin, "I'll be seated at the right hand of God." But the Jews kept presenting him as a king, threatening Caesar in this world. But eventually, even though Pilate didn't believe it, he handed him over to be impaled. So again, the accounts in the Gospels involving Jesus, whether it's paying taxes to Caesar, whether it's the actions in John 11 that lead the Jews to be concerned about the Romans taking away their place in their nation, or whether it's Jesus before the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, or Herod, nothing that he says indicates that his followers who wrote these accounts understood Jesus to be threatening Rome. Everything we read indicates he was not a threat to Rome, from his wanting taxes to be paid to Caesar, give Caesar's things to Caesar, give God's things to God. So just like he wanted God's things to be given back to God, he wanted Caesar's things to be given back to Caesar. And everything he told Pilate, including his kingdom not being a part of this world, indicates that he was understood as someone who was not threatening Rome. Now, let's just take a quick look at a couple more texts on this subject of taxes. Let's go to Luke 3. This is an account involving John the Baptist. And let's see, right, this is someone who is presented as the forerunner of Jesus, who obviously accepted Jesus and believed in Jesus. So how is he presented when it comes to the paying of taxes? Right? If Jesus was against taxes, paying taxes to Rome like the Jews said he was, even though that's not what he said, what about John the Baptist? Luke 3, 12 through 13. And this is when John's doing baptizing, right? Preparing the way, like we read about in Malachi for the Messiah. It says, "But even the tax collectors came to be baptized, and they said to him, 'Teacher, what shall we do?' And John the Baptist says, 'Do not demand anything more than the tax rate.'" He doesn't say not to pay taxes, even though tax collectors were not viewed favorably. Even though they knew that their money was being collected, they had taxes for the temple and, of course, taxes for Rome. But John doesn't even say anything about not paying taxes. In fact, he's saying to pay taxes here, isn't he? He's just telling the tax collectors not to demand more, right? Don't make money on the side. Don't abuse people. Just demand the tax rate. Now let's take a look at Jesus in one more account about taxes. Matthew 17. And again, we're trying to answer the question, was Jesus someone who led a revolt against the Romans and was killed for his trouble, like Ben Shapiro says? Does the evidence support that? We're looking at the evidence from the Bible first, right? If Jesus actually believed that, if that's what he was trying to do, you would expect his followers to be behind that too, right? They would be in favor of revolting against Rome. And yet that's not what we're seeing presented about Jesus. That's not what we're seeing he said to Pilate or in any way implied he was trying to do. And even John the Baptist is not someone who was against paying taxes. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. And after he talks about how he's going to be betrayed, it says, after they arrived in Capernaum, the men collecting the 2 drachmas tax approached Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachmas tax? Verse 25, he said, yes. However, when he entered the house, that is Peter, Jesus got ahead of him by saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth receive duties or head tax? From their sons or from strangers? Verse 26, when he said from strangers, Jesus said to Peter, really then, the sons are tax-free. So you might think, okay, now he's saying we don't have to pay taxes. Well, of course, we know he said to give Caesar's things back to Caesar. But then in verse 27, he explains further, but that we do not cause them to stumble, you go to the sea, cast a fish hook, and take the first fish coming up. When you open its mouth, you'll find a stater coin. Take that and give it to them for me and you. Right? So even when Jesus is talking about how technically he considers them tax-free, he's still not speaking against or presented by his followers as speaking against the paying of taxes. All right, well, so it's whether it's to Rome or to the temple. We have accounts of Jesus and John supporting the paying of taxes. And this will come up later on, too, when we get to the New Testament book of Romans. But before we do that, let's talk about the book of Acts. All right, so I already talked about how in the 4 gospel accounts of the New Testament, the word Rome doesn't appear one single time. And so for someone who's allegedly leading a revolt against Rome, I find that very odd. The only time the word Romans is used is in John 11:48, where the enemies of Jesus, those who rejected him, respond to his miracle working, nothing that he says about Caesar or revolting against Rome, as indicating that the more people put faith in him, they'll lose their place in their nation from the Romans. When in fact, he was for paying taxes to Rome, as we saw when they tried to trick him. So that likely would not have happened. Nothing Jesus was doing or teaching was in any way a threat to Rome, according to the documents from his earliest followers that show what he was doing and teaching. And if he was teaching and acting like leading a revolt against Rome, I think somewhere in these 4 records that would be evident. Not just in the mouths of his enemies, right? Because that indicates that it wasn't the case. That indicates that the people who rejected him believed that, just like Ben, right? Maybe not with the full same intent of killing him, but for some reason, both Ben and the Jews of the New Testament and Orthodox Jews today want to link Jesus with a revolt against Rome, when nothing his followers attribute to him saying indicates that. What he's attributed or believed to have said suggests that he wouldn't have been a threat to Rome, both when it came to the paying of taxes and whether or not he felt he was a king like Caesar, whether his kingdom was a part of this world. So Jesus and his earliest followers and all the followers of Jesus since that time, the first century, have never believed Jesus was leading a revolt against Rome. There's no evidence whatsoever, except in the mouths of Jesus' enemies, that there was any kind of threat to Rome at all. And even then, in John 11:48, as I've explained, the basis for their concern is not really connected to a genuine threat at all. And then when you combine the fact that he was for the paying of taxes and his kingdom was no part of this world and therefore not a threat to Caesar, the John 11:48 reference does not connect with the evidence. And I know Ben is a big evidence guy, right? So am I. And we need to connect the evidence, not just believe what the enemies of someone have to say. You believe anything potentially that way. But let's take a look at the book of Acts. In Acts, we get the word Rome actually mentioned, unlike in the four gospel records. The word Rome is mentioned 6 times in Acts. Let's go to Acts chapter 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at Acts chapter 2, just as our first use of Rome, really in the New Testament. Acts chapter 2, verse 10. This is just a casual reference to their traveling. So it's talking about how they were speaking in tongues, right? They had been filled with the Holy Spirit. And according to Christian belief and according to the book of Acts, they started to speak in different languages because of this miraculous power from God that allowed them to spread the good news, as we call it, the great message of Jesus throughout the earth, which is why Christianity is so well known at this time, in spite of being a relatively small sect at the time of Pilate and Jesus that was openly condemned through his execution, and then even later through persecutions in the first century. But we believe through events like this, right? You don't have to believe it, but this is Christian belief. So it talks about how that occurred, start speaking in different languages. And then it says that they were hearing in their different languages, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and the inhabitants of Mesopotamia and Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, district of Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya, which is toward Cyrene, and sojourners from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. Excuse me. Cat issues again. Right? So both Jews and proselytes from Rome. So just basic geography here in terms of the first reference in the book of Acts. Now let's go to Acts 18, verse 2. This one's a little more significant. So it talks about the different travelings of Paul and how after he left this group, some men joined themselves to him, became believers. Among them also were Dionysius, a judge of the court of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and others besides them. Verse 18:1, after these things he departed from Athens and came to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy, and Priscilla his wife, because of the fact that Claudius, Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 CE, the first century, had ordered all the Jews to depart from Rome. So he went with them. All right. Now, this account here in Acts 18:2 appears to be consistent with what Suetonius writes in his work about Claudius. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up, and we'll read it together. And this is from the Perseus site, Suetonius' work Divus Claudius, in section 25. I'll just scroll down a little bit here. He's talking about Claudius, and he says he banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Now, I've done a video and I've written a paper. They're both linked below in the description, where I talk about the non-biblical evidence of Jesus and his historicity. And this is one of the pieces that I cite because when we look at one of the later church fathers, Tertullian, and his discussion of the word Christus and Chrestus, he points out that non-Christians wrongly use Chrestus when it should be Christus. So I believe this reference in Suetonius actually supports the historicity of Jesus and Jews who were in Rome, or at least Jews and Christians who were in Rome and who were either disputing or promoting, right? Because this disturbance, this does not mean necessarily a revolt. It talks about how Claudius banished the Jews, and before Claudius did so, Tiberius did so as well for different reasons and banished a bunch of other people. But it says all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. So the disturbance seems to me to be very like what we see and read about in Acts. The different instigations between the Christians and the Jews because of Jesus, because of Chrestus or Christus. So it seems to me that we have in Acts 18, right here, when it writes about Aquila and his wife Priscilla meeting with Paul because they were ordered out of Rome by Claudius. I think we're talking about the same thing that is being discussed by Suetonius right here. And so just like you had Paul going to different places, eventually to Rome as well, you had Jews like Aquila and Priscilla who were already in Rome and who may have been a part of these different disturbances involving Jews and Christians, disputes over Jesus, whether or not he was the Messiah or Christ. So this is the second time that Rome is mentioned in the New Testament, right here in Acts 18:2, related to the events in Rome involving Claudius's order that all the Jews should leave because of the instigation involving Chrestus or Christus. The disturbances. Doesn't say that revolt, right? They would have been executed if they were in revolt against Rome. They would have been crucified. Just like Jesus, although under false charges, as we saw, right? It was the Jews pressuring Pilate and insisting that he was making himself a king against Caesar in spite of what Pilate understood from Jesus himself. So if that would have been happening in Rome, they wouldn't have just ordered them out. They would have been executed for threatening Caesar. And so I believe that the instigation related to Chrestus or Christus, Jesus, was these ongoing disputes between the Jews and the Christians involving Jesus. All right, now let's go to the third time Rome is used in the book of Acts. And remember, we're talking about Ben Shapiro's claim that Jesus was one who led a revolt against Rome and was executed for his trouble. Yet the word Rome is not mentioned one time in the four Gospels. The word Romans is mentioned one time in the four Gospels, and that in the mouths of Jesus' enemies, in a context where he doesn't do or say anything about Rome or leading a revolt against Rome, and where in the rest of the Gospel records, he doesn't do or teach anything against Rome, not when it comes to the paying of taxes, nor when it comes to his kingdom and him being a king. He speaks about being at the right hand of God in heaven, and his kingdom being no part of this world, of Caesar's world. And that's why Pilate doesn't agree with the Jews' assessment of him. Let's take a look at the third instance of Rome in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. New Testament overall, in the book of Acts specifically. Acts 19:21. And here it says, "Now when these things had been completed, Paul purposed in his spirit that after going through Macedonia and Achaia, he would journey to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I get there, I must also see Rome.'" So he's just talking about his desire to visit Rome here. Now let's go to the fourth instance of Rome in the New Testament, and specifically in the book of Acts, since that's where it first appears. Acts 23, verse 11. And there it says, but the following night, the Lord stood by him. Actually, you know what here? Yeah, we'll read just verse 11. So it's talking about Paul's been in a lot of disputes with the Jews at this point, and the different officials are getting involved. And here it refers to Jesus, the Lord, appearing to Paul and saying, be of good courage, for as you have given a thorough witness on the things about me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness in Rome. So here we have, according to Christian tradition and the New Testament writings, Jesus appearing to Paul, and he doesn't say anything about leading a revolt against Rome. Excuse me. He just says that like you've been talking about me in Jerusalem, you're going to talk about me in Rome. And there was no revolt that was led by the Christians or by Paul in Jerusalem. They just kept speaking about Jesus. And the religious leaders and other officials were trying to stop them for different reasons, right? You had different people, including people like the silversmith and others in different locations, that would react to the message being taught by the Christians. But that's not a revolt, right? That's them perceiving a threat to their livelihood because of their false gods and different things that are part of the Christian message, which we'll get to more in regards to a famous Roman historian later in a moment, and with regard to Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan. But there's no indication that there was any revolt in Jerusalem or in Rome, just disturbances because of the teaching, because of what they were proclaiming that the Jews didn't like. And the Jews were obviously a more established religion than the Christians at this time. They had more influence. But Paul had more influence than your average everyday Christian. So he was able to deal with this more effectively than many others were. But again, here, Jesus just tells Paul, you're going to bear witness about me in Rome. And we know from Jesus himself that his kingdom is no part of this world, and that you're to give Caesar's things back to Caesar. And as we're going to see in a moment, Paul wrote a whole letter to the Roman Christians where he says things that clearly are inconsistent with someone who believed his Lord wanted him to revolt against Rome. All right, let's take a look at Acts 28:14. There's actually the last two of the 6 occurrences of Rome in the book of Acts. Acts 28:14 are right here. It says here, where they was talking about putting into port at Syracuse, remaining for 3 days, from which place we went around, arrived at Rhegium, and a day later a south wind sprang up, and we made it into Puteoli, and on the second day, and here we found brothers, and were entreated to remain with them 7 days, and in this way we came toward Rome. So just geographical reference to Rome here. And from there the brothers, when they heard the news about us, came to meet us as far as the marketplace of Appius and 3 taverns. And upon catching sight of them, Paul thanked God and took courage. When finally we entered Rome, Paul was permitted to stay by himself with a soldier guarding him. So that's it when it comes to the use of Rome in the 4 Gospels, where it doesn't appear, just Romans, like we talked about, John 11:48, which has nothing to do with Jesus leading a revolt or even acting or teaching in any way consistent with a revolt against Rome. And where overall the Gospels present him as doing and teaching things that are no threat to Caesar, no threat to Rome, and that his enemies tried to set him up when it came to the paying of taxes and making his kingdom a part of this world, which would be a threat to Rome, which he explicitly denied when talking to Pilate. But if we go a little further into the New Testament to the letter of Romans that I've referenced several times, that Paul wrote, look at what he says in verses 1 through 6. So Paul, someone who wasn't with Jesus when he was alive as a man, but who persecuted his Christian followers, eventually claimed to have Jesus appeared to him from heaven and assigned him a ministry that he later took seriously, and that the book of Acts says Jesus appeared to him, commended him for bearing witness in Jerusalem, told him he'd bear witness in Rome. So you have this figure who's very much associated with Jesus in his resurrection state, right? They could have said anything. But it's all consistent with what Jesus is said to have said in the four gospel accounts. No threat to Rome, kingdom not part of this world, give Caesar's things to Caesar. And specifically the taxes that the Jews were questioning about. Look at what Paul says. This one who's given himself to Christianity, claimed that Jesus appeared to him multiple times. So he's following the teachings of Jesus that he's learned. He's claiming to follow what he was directly told by Jesus. This is what he says about Rome. Verse 1, let every soul be in subjection to the superior authorities, for there is no authority except by God. That's exactly what Jesus told Pilate, is it not? In John 19, he told Pilate, you'd have no authority at all if it wasn't given to you from above. Consistent with right here, which is why we should see the political institutions of this earth as something ordained by God. They're not originating with the world. God put them in place, consistent with his assignment of the nations to the sons of God in the Dead Sea Scroll text of Deuteronomy 32:8, and what we see described for us in detail in Daniel about the princes of Persia, Greece, and Israel. How they're assigned, given authority during this period of time when man has authority and is in a sinful state. Right? So these arrangements are in place by God. It says right here, the existing authorities stand placed in their positions by God. There is no authority except by God. You would have no authority at all if it wasn't given to you from above. Therefore, this is Paul again, consistent with Jesus. He who opposes the authority has taken a stand against the arrangement of God. If Jesus led a revolt against Rome, wouldn't that be opposing the authority that Jesus himself said was given from above to Pilate, to Rome? That Paul, Jesus' follower, says is given from above, no authority except by God, to the existing authorities, Rome? So why would Jesus have revolted against Rome if he believed that Rome's authority came from above? He wouldn't. He didn't. All the evidence shows he was looking for the kingdom from above at the right hand of God, not on this earth. And that's why he said to pay the taxes to the king of this earth and give God's things to God. So Paul would have had to believe that Jesus took a stand against the arrangement of God. That's inconsistent with what the records of Jesus' earliest followers said Jesus taught, that Pilate received his authority from above, consistent with Paul, and the fact that the existing authorities stand placed in their positions by God. So if Paul in any way understood Jesus to have been someone revolting against Rome, that that's what Jesus wanted to do, right? If Ben's correct, that that's why Jesus was killed, that that's what he was wanting to do, not just that he was killed because the Jews falsely accused him and convinced Pilate to do it. That's not what Ben's talking about. He thinks he's just a man who led a revolt against Rome and was killed for his trouble. Ben doesn't say that he was falsely accused of leading a revolt against Rome and killed because he was falsely accused. That's the truth. That's the real history and story according to the New Testament, the earliest Christians, and as I'm going to show in a moment, consistent also with Roman history. So Paul goes on to say, For those ruling are an object of fear, not to the good deed, but to the bad. Do you then want to have no fear of authority? Keep doing good, and you will have praise from it. For it is God's minister to you for your good. But if you are doing what is bad, be in fear, for it is not without purpose that it bears the sword. It is God's minister. These are Christians. This is a Christian writing to Roman Christians about how they should view the government, Rome, as God's minister. This is someone who claimed to be taught directly by Jesus in his post-resurrection state, which, when you consider what he is teaching, is consistent with Jesus in his human state. You would have no authority at all except from above. My kingdom is no part of this world. Give Caesar's things back to Caesar. An avenger to express wrath upon the one practicing what is bad. There is therefore compelling reason for you people to be in subjection, not only on account of that wrath, but also on account of your conscience. For that is why you are also paying taxes. For they are God's public servants, constantly serving this very purpose. Render to all their dues, to him who calls for the tax, the taxed, to him who calls for the tribute, to him who calls for fear, such fear, to him who calls for honor, such honor. That's a Christian. That's a first century follower of Jesus who claimed to be following the teachings of Jesus that were reported to him by those who were with Jesus and directly as received from Jesus in his heavenly state. All consistent with what Jesus is said to have taught in his human state, that is, give the taxes back to Caesar. His kingdom is no part of this world. You would have no authority at all if not given to you from above. The existing authorities are placed by God. So where is the revolt? Where's the indication or any idea that Jesus was doing anything but acting consistent with what he is said to have said and what his earliest followers taught? That they should be submissive to the existing governments, not revolting. Paul doesn't say anything here about revolting against Rome. He says just the opposite. Just like Pilate understood from Jesus that it was just the opposite of what the Jews were telling him was true, which is consistent with what Ben is saying is true, that Jesus was leading a revolt against Rome. Nothing in the New Testament records about Jesus, his teachings, or what Paul writes about Jesus, his teachings, and what Paul is teaching the Romans, none of what Ben and the enemies of Jesus in the New Testament said about Jesus, claim about Jesus leading a revolt against Rome, is true. It's totally inconsistent with everything we read and that is connected with Jesus by the people who believed he was the Messiah. And if they felt that Jesus wanted them to revolt against Rome, why would they write this? Right? It'd be the last thing they would write. If anything, they'd just be quiet about it so not to get attention, right? No, Paul comes right out and talks about that they should be submissive, that it's God's servant, right? It's the authority from God, not the pagan Roman gods. He's talking about the Christian, the Judeo-Christian God. That's what Paul is trying to get them to understand, just like Jesus told Pilate. So it's completely inconsistent with the idea that Jesus or his earliest followers understood him to be a revolutionary against Rome, that he was trying to subvert the authority of Rome. Now let's take a look at a letter written to Rome. The Roman Emperor Trajan, by Pliny the Younger, around 112 AD, so the early 2nd century. And if Jesus and his earliest followers were revolting against Rome, right? At the instigation at Crestus involving the Jews in Suetonius, it's also referred to in Acts 18, was some kind of revolt, then that would be a consistent theme, I would think, with the Christians. It would be known about them. Yet, none of that is said about them. Paul writes explicitly against that kind of action, and Jesus is represented as teaching entirely inconsistent ideas and practices with a revolt against Rome. Let's go ahead and take a look at Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan about these early Christians, right? 112. That's not too far away from the mid to late part of the first century, obviously, right? This is the early second century. And here's what Pliny has to say to the Emperor of Rome. It is a rule, sir, which I invariably observe, to refer myself to you in all my doubts. For who is more capable of guiding my uncertainty or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the method and limits to be observed either in examining or punishing them. So obviously Pliny has never had an experience with Christians all the way to this point in the early second century, right? Several decades after they've been established and growing as a small sect still, but still growing, becoming more and more widely known, as evidenced by this letter here. He's never seen or been acquainted with any kind of revolt with these Christians, or he would mention it here as something he's familiar with. I'm unacquainted with the method and limits to be observed, either in examining or punishing them, whether any difference is to be made on account of age, or no distinction allowed between the youngest and the adult, whether repentance admits to a pardon, or if a man has been once a Christian, it avails him nothing to recant, whether the mere profession of Christianity, albeit without crimes, or only the crimes associated therewith, are punishable. In all these points I am greatly doubtful. In the meanwhile, the method I have observed toward those who have been denounced to me as Christians is this. I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment, death. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their creed might be, I could at least feel no doubt that contumacy and inflexible obstinacy deserved chastisement. There were others also possessed of the same infatuation, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be carried thither, or taken to Rome. Right? So he doesn't even know there's nothing at all in Pliny's mind or associations with Christians that involves this idea that they revolt against Rome as a practice because of what their leader taught them or what their leader did. So he goes on, these accusations spread, as is usually the case, from the mere fact of the matter being investigated, and several forms of the mischief came to light. A placard was put up without any signature accusing a large number of persons by name. Those who denied they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration with wine and frankincense to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for that purpose, together with those of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, one of which acts it is said those who are really Christians cannot be forced into performing, these I thought it proper to discharge. Others who were named by that informer at first confessed themselves Christians and then denied it. True, they had been of that persuasion, but they had quitted it, some 3 years, others many years, and a few as much as 25 years ago. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt, right? So now Pliny is talking about those who confessed they were Christians, but they quitted it some years ago. Many years ago, or as much as 25 years ago, putting them much closer to the time period of Paul, and covering a pretty long period of time to become familiar with the beliefs and practices of Christians from the late 1st century into the early 2nd century. So what did those who then confessed and then cursed Christ to save their lives, what did they say that they were guilty of? What did they say the Christians were doing that they were no longer going to do because he was going to let them live now that they quit it? Here's what he says. They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, while they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but to never commit fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Even this practice, however, they had abandoned after the publication of my edict, by which, according to your orders, I had forbidden political associations. I judged it so much more than necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves who were styled deaconesses. But I could discover nothing more than the depraved and excessive superstition. Nothing here about a revolt. In fact, they were even politically active, right? He says right here that he had forbidden political associations after the publication of his edict. So that shows they had political associations before he forbade it. And then, I'll go ahead and bring my little self in here. And then they went ahead and abandoned their practices after his edict and explained to Pliny the things they were doing before they abandoned doing them. None of which have anything at all to do with subverting Rome, revolting against Rome, and which appeared to involve political associations or involvement before Pliny forbid it. He's concerned about their strange non-Roman religious associations and practices, right? Nothing that he's describing here in any way leads to the impression that the Christians were involved in anything related to a revolt. So then he goes on and talks about different things, writing about his concern. It's becoming a more well-known sect at this point. In fact, let's just go ahead and read the rest of the letter. Down at the bottom, I therefore adjourned the proceedings, betook myself at once to your council, right? Even under torture, they didn't declare anything involving a revolt. It's not even something they would say to save their skins, their lives, or lie about. It just doesn't come up. Again, they actually appeared to have political associations until they were forbid being able to do so. So then Pliny says he betook to Trajan's council. The matter seemed to him well worth referring to Trajan, especially considering the numbers endangered. Persons of all ranks and ages of both sexes are and will be involved in the prosecution. A lot of people. For this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but is spread through the villages, rural districts. It seems possible, however, to check and cure it. 'Tis certain at least that the temples, which had been almost deserted, begin now to be frequented, and the sacred festivals, after a long intermission, are again revived. But while there is general demand for sacrificial animals, which for some times past have met with but few purchasers, from hence it is easy to imagine what multitudes may be reclaimed from this error if a door is left open to repentance. Right? So there's a lot of people here involved. A lot of Christians that go back to the late 1st century, right? 25 years before this letter in about 112. Pliny says there were Christians here that go back 25 years and who confessed to him after cursing the Christ and sacrificing to the gods' images, that all they did was agree by oath not to commit any wicked deeds, not to commit fraud, theft, adultery, or falsify their word, or break their trust, and to partake of food of an ordinary and innocent kind, and to assemble together every morning. Right? And so then you have all these different people from all ages, sexes, and ranks, Pliny says, doing these things. And he doesn't say anything about them trying to subvert the authority of Rome. Right? Which would be inconsistent with what? Jesus, no kingdom is no part of this world, and Paul, to be submissive to the existing authorities that stand placed by God. That we should submit to them and render taxes, honor, and tribute. So it just doesn't come up at all in this letter by Pliny to Trajan. Well, let's just go ahead and take a look at Trajan's reply real briefly. Trajan writes to Pliny, "The method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper. It's not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people." Right? So if they felt that the Christians were a threat to Rome, trying to create a revolt against Rome like their leader, which is not true, why would Trajan be so unconcerned? Right? They're concerned in the sense that the Christians obviously don't follow Roman religion, but they're really not concerned, right, in the social sense that these people are a threat to Caesar, that they're leading a revolt against Rome, or that their history or their leader, the one to whom they sang hymns as to a god, John 1:1, right, not God, like the way Trinitarians mistranslate and misquote Pliny's letter to Trajan. I did a whole show about it. Trajan wouldn't be acting like this. He wouldn't say no search should be made for people if they're trying to subvert my authority. When they are denounced and found guilty, they must be punished. With the restriction, however, that when the party denies himself to be a Christian and gives proof that he is not by adoring our gods, right, this is what they're concerned about, adoring their gods, he shall be pardoned on the ground of repentance, even though he may have formerly incurred suspicion. Informations without the accuser's name subscribed must not be admitted in evidence against anyone, as it is introducing a very dangerous precedent and by no means agreeable to the spirit of the age. So at least some reasonableness there on the part of Trajan, but still loyalty to the Roman gods, right? Nothing at all about any idea related to the Christians and revolting against the nation, or that Jesus was someone who did that. Now let's take a look at one last authority, Tacitus. Go ahead and bring up Tacitus and see what he had to say. Rome's greatest historian, writing around 116, not too long after Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan, but writing about events much earlier, specifically related to Jesus. Tacitus, in his Annals, 1544, he's talking about Nero and some of the actions that Nero was involved with. He's talking about the things, of course, that occurred in relation to the fire at Rome. And then Tacitus writes, consequently, to get rid of the report, the different things that were being said about Nero, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, not for their revolt, called the Christians, or called Christians by the populace. Christus, this is the more proper reference, whereas Suetonius wrote Chrestus, just like Tertullian, writing later, said non-Christians wrongly wrote. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and became popular. And he goes on to say, accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. He's talking about the Christians. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of a crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. So Tacitus, writing about the Christians in relation to Christ, the one whom Tacitus explicitly states was put to death during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate because of a superstition. He writes that the Christians were put to death in these horrible, terrible ways, not necessarily for firing the city, even though Nero likely used them as an excuse for what happened, but because of their hatred of mankind, right? Because they rejected humankind as, in the same way, necessary the way the Romans viewed them. That's how they were seen, as people who hated mankind and who, like Jesus, looked forward to a kingdom that's not part of this world, right? It's not part of this world. Even though Christians don't hate mankind, right? We read that in Paul, Romans chapter 13, where he talks about submitting to the existing authorities because they're punishment for the wicked, not punishment to the good, even though they could be used wrongly in that way, like they did with Nero, or were with Nero, right? Again, there's nothing here. They pleaded guilty about being Christians. They were viewed as hating humankind, not revolting against Rome, but having a mischievous superstition that broke out in Judea and then broke out in Rome. The beliefs, right? Their teachings, their ideas about what was going to happen in this world and in the next world. Not a revolt against Caesar. We just read earlier that the founder, Christus, taught his kingdom is no part of this world. So what are they going to revolt for? He taught to pay Caesar their taxes. What are they going to revolt for? He taught that Pilate's authority came from above, exactly like Paul, one of Jesus' earliest followers, taught the Romans. In his letter to the Romans was true also, that there'd be no authority existing except by God, that the existing authorities stand placed in their position by God, so that we shouldn't revolt against them. We should give them their honor, their due, their tribute, and their taxes. The very things that the Jews who rejected Jesus said he didn't want them to receive, and tried to use as a pretext wrongly to convict Jesus of making himself a king that was a threat to Caesar. All right, let's go to our last text and then we'll wrap it up. The book of Acts. Let's go back to Acts one more time. And we'll read chapter 23. And let's just see what Paul had to say when being accused before others. In this case, we're going to read about a letter written by a military commander about Paul to Antonius Felix, the younger brother of Marcus Antonius Paulus, who served as secretary of the treasury during the reign of Emperor Claudius. So these are well-known historical figures, and Paul is right in the middle of some of these figures as someone who's doing things that are getting their attention, again in connection with the Jews about Jesus. Not because he's teaching to revolt against Rome, but because he's teaching that Jesus is the biblical Messiah. That like Jesus accepted, he's the Son of God. That's what the Jews rejected. That's what the Jews are contesting with people like Paul. And that's why he's the subject of a letter to Antonius Felix in Acts 23. Let's read verses 25 through 29. Right? So here's the military commander sending someone about to go after Paul because they realize Paul's in danger. People have come to tell him that the Jews are laying in wait to do away with him. And so he's been told, this military commander, about the Jews' plan to kill Paul. And then he summons a certain two of his army officers and says, go get 200 soldiers ready to march to Caesarea. Also 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen at the third hour of the night. Also provide beasts of burden that they may have Paul ride and convey him safely to Felix the governor. Antonius Felix is who he's talking about. And then the military commander wrote a letter that says this: Claudius Lysias to His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be done away with by them. But I came suddenly with a force of soldiers and rescued him, because I learned he was a Roman. And wishing to ascertain the cause for which they were accusing him, I brought him down into their Sanhedrin, into their Supreme Court. Verse 29, and I found him to be accused about a revolt, about subverting Caesar's authority. No, I found him to be accused about questions of their law, the Jewish law, but not charged with a single thing deserving of death or bonds. Who does that remind you of? Who does that sound like? It reminds me of what we read in the accounts involving Jesus and Pilate and the Jews who were falsely accusing Jesus of not wanting to pay taxes to Caesar, of instigating their nation against Rome, of making himself a king that was a threat to Caesar, and Pilate listening to them all, questioning Jesus, Jesus telling him, my kingdom is no part of this world. Knowing, as the Jews did, that Jesus promoted the paying of taxes to Caesar. He did not forbid it. That the Jews believed he claimed he was the Son of God, which they also accused him of in the Sanhedrin, after they failed to get grounds against him for not paying taxes to Caesar. Here in Acts 23, we get the same thing. We get Paul, the subject of Jewish persecution, and a military commander, Claudius Lysias, after learning Paul's a Roman citizen, rescuing Paul from the Jews who were lying in wait to get him, sending him to Governor Felix, and saying that the only thing he could find was that he's being accused over things having to do with their law, and not finding anything deserving of death or bonds, just like Pilate told the Jews, I find no fault in this man. I don't find anything deserving of death. You have a law, judge him according to your law. It's not lawful for us to kill anyone, right? Because they're under Roman occupation. Even though their law did provide grounds for killing people, they already tried that. So they took him before Pilate after they couldn't find grounds to get him subverting Caesar openly. They took him to Pilate because they rejected him as the Son of God and lied about him. They just made it up. That he claimed that he was a king like Caesar. That he was subverting the nation against Rome. That he was forbidding the paying of taxes, even though we could see in the account provided to us, at least, by those who followed Jesus. And so if he was a revolutionary, if he did lead a revolt against Rome, they would be the ones doing the same thing. Yet we find them not only writing about Jesus in ways that are totally inconsistent with everything that would make us believe that thing, that he was leading a revolt against Rome. We also find his earliest followers like Paul writing to Romans about submitting as though they are God's minister, Rome, and paying taxes, just like Jesus said you should pay, to Rome. And we find Roman historians like Tacitus writing about Jesus being put to death by Pilate, not for a revolt against Rome, but for a mischievous superstition. We find Pliny the Younger writing to an emperor of Rome, saying nothing about them being subversive to the government, even implying that they held political positions, that they were trying to be honest, trustworthy, not steal, do very basic things that Christians do, right? Eat bread and wine, come together and assemble, sing to the Christ as to a God, the Son of God, who is to us God. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Not because he's part of a Trinity. The Bible doesn't teach that. That's later stuff. That's later Christianity that became politically involved with Rome to the point where non-biblical terms like homoousios displaced biblical terms like charactertes hypostaseos, Hebrews 1:3, and changed the Christian religion forever, at least to the extent that many people practice it. But we have the texts that clearly tell us what was taught and believed long before the Trinity, and that teach us explicitly about people like Jesus and Paul and the earliest Christians and what they were to do and what they did. And it never involved Jesus, Paul, or the earliest Christians leading a revolt against Rome.